The bitter wind swept across the snow-covered hills of the Italian countryside as Lieutenant James Alvin Walsh huddled in the cramped observation post. It was December 1943, and the Allied push toward Rome had stalled against fierce German resistance along the Gustav Line. Walsh, a 26-year-old officer from a small town in Pennsylvania, had been with the 36th Infantry Division since the landings at Salerno 3 months earlier. Nothing in his background, not his education at the local community college, nor his brief career as a hardware store clerk, had prepared him for the brutal realities of combat against Hitler's Wehrmacht. Yet here he was, peering through binoculars at enemy positions while contemplating the impossible mission he had been assigned. "You want me to do what exactly, sir?" Walsh had asked earlier that morning when his battalion commander, Major Robert Harrison, had called him into the command tent. Harrison, a career Army officer with a reputation for unconventional tactics, had spread a map across the wooden ammunition crate that served as his desk. "Intelligence reports indicate the Germans have established a forward headquarters in this valley," Harrison explained, pointing to a location 3 miles behind enemy lines. "We believe it's being used to coordinate their artillery fire that's been pinning down our advance. We need someone to get eyes on that position, confirm its purpose, and if possible, disrupt their operations." Walsh studied the map with growing unease. The route to the suspected headquarters would take him through territory crawling with German patrols. "What kind of support would I have, sir?" he asked. Harrison's expression remained impassive. "This is a stealth mission, Lieutenant. No artillery support, no backup. Just you and a small team, 3 men at most. Any larger force would be detected." Walsh nodded slowly, understanding the implications. A small team meant minimal firepower. They would have to rely on stealth and cunning rather than combat power. "When do we leave?" Walsh asked. "Tonight," Harrison replied, under cover of darkness. "I need volunteers who understand the risks." Walsh left the command tent with a growing weight in his stomach. Finding men willing to embark on what amounted to a suicide mission would not be easy. As dusk approached, Walsh had assembled his team, 2 soldiers who had proven their courage and resourcefulness in previous engagements. Corporal Thomas Riley was a former hunting guide from Montana with an uncanny ability to move silently through any terrain. Private First Class Anthony Rossi had been a locksmith in civilian life and had demonstrated remarkable skill at gaining entry to secured buildings during urban combat in the towns they had fought through. Both men listened silently as Walsh outlined the mission parameters. "We'll be lightly armed," he explained. "Each man carries only a sidearm and a knife. No rifles, no submachine guns. Nothing that would compromise our stealth." Riley raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Rossi nodded, his face betraying no emotion. Neither man questioned the order or requested reassignment. Their quiet acceptance only increased Walsh's sense of responsibility for their lives. The 3 men slipped through the American lines at 2200 hours, using a drainage culvert that intelligence had identified as a potential infiltration route. The December night was moonless, with heavy cloud cover providing additional concealment. The temperature had dropped below freezing, their breath forming small clouds in the darkness. They moved slowly, methodically, pausing every few minutes to listen for enemy movements. Riley took point, guiding them through the snow-covered landscape with an instinctive understanding of how to minimize their visibility and sound. Walsh carried only his standard-issue Colt M1911 pistol, a compass, and a small field radio for emergency communication. The weight of command felt heavier than any physical burden he had ever carried. By midnight, they had covered less than a mile, their progress slowed by the need to avoid German patrols. They encountered their first real obstacle at a small stream that cut across their path. The water was shallow but frigid, and crossing it would mean wet boots for the remainder of the mission. As they searched for a narrower crossing point, Rossi suddenly raised his hand in warning. The faint sound of German voices carried through the darkness. Walsh signaled for his men to take cover as a patrol of 4 German soldiers approached the stream less than 50 yards away. The Germans appeared to be taking a break, lighting cigarettes and speaking in hushed tones. Walsh and his team remained motionless in the underbrush, barely breathing as the enemy soldiers lingered by the water's edge. The moment stretched into minutes as the German patrol showed no signs of moving on. Walsh knew that each delay increased the risk of mission failure. Dawn was only a few hours away, and they needed to reach the target, gather intelligence, and begin their return journey before daylight exposed them. He considered options. A detour would cost precious time, while confronting the patrol would alert the enemy to their presence. As he weighed these unappealing alternatives, fate intervened in an unexpected way. One of the German soldiers, having finished his cigarette, began walking directly toward their position, apparently seeking privacy to relieve himself. Walsh tensed, his hand moving to his pistol, knowing that discovery was now almost certain. What happened next would later be described by Riley as the beginning of the most incredible night of the war. The German soldier, fumbling with his uniform in the darkness, practically stumbled over their position. Before he could cry out, Riley had him in a chokehold, his hand clamped firmly over the man's mouth. Walsh pressed his pistol against the soldier's temple, whispering in the rudimentary German he had learned during training. "Quiet. No sound or you die." The soldier's eyes widened with fear and understanding. Walsh motioned for Rossi to secure the prisoner while he assessed the situation. The other 3 Germans remained by the stream, unaware of their comrade's predicament. Walsh now faced a critical decision: eliminate the patrol quietly or use the captured soldier to their advantage. After a brief whispered conference, Walsh implemented a desperate plan. He instructed Rossi to bind and gag their prisoner securely, then used the German's own knife to cut away insignia from the man's uniform. With Riley covering the prisoner, Walsh and Rossi crept toward the remaining 3 Germans. When they were within 15 feet, Walsh deliberately stepped on a branch, creating a sharp cracking sound that caused the Germans to turn in surprise. In the darkness, they saw only the silhouette of what appeared to be their returning comrade, with Walsh keeping his face in shadow. Walsh called out a greeting in German, then continued forward while gesturing as if he were explaining something. The momentary confusion was all they needed. As the Germans hesitated, Walsh and Rossi closed the distance and had their pistols drawn before the enemy soldiers realized the deception. "Hände hoch," Walsh ordered, hands up, his Colt now clearly visible in the dim light. The 3 Germans, surprised and confused, slowly raised their hands. Walsh maintained his composure despite his racing heart, keeping his voice steady as he instructed them to drop their weapons. Rossi quickly collected the surrendered rifles and pistols, removing ammunition and slinging the weapons over his shoulder. Within minutes, all 3 Germans were bound with their own belts and equipment straps, seated back to back on the cold ground. Walsh faced a new dilemma. The mission parameters had not accounted for taking prisoners. He couldn't leave them here to be freed by the next patrol, but executing surrendered prisoners was unthinkable. After consultation with Riley and Rossi, Walsh made a decision that would prove crucial to the extraordinary events that followed. "We'll take them with us," he declared, ignoring the incredulous expressions of his team. "Rossi, explain to them that any sound or attempt to alert other German forces will result in their immediate execution." Rossi, whose Italian heritage had given him a workable understanding of German, conveyed the message with convincing menace. Walsh then addressed the captives directly in his limited German. "You are now walking us safely to your headquarters. You will act normally if we encounter any patrols. If you cooperate, you live. If you attempt to alert your comrades, you die first. The prisoners," seeing the determination in Walsh's eyes and the unwavering aim of his pistol, nodded their understanding. What followed was a tense journey through enemy territory, with the 4 German prisoners walking in single file ahead of Walsh and his team. When they encountered another German patrol an hour later, Walsh implemented the deception he had hastily developed. One of the prisoners, with Walsh's pistol pressed discreetly against his back, explained to the patrol that they were escorting American prisoners to headquarters for interrogation. The darkness, the presumption of German authority, and the unexpected nature of the claim worked in their favor. The patrol, seeing German uniforms in the lead and only glimpsing the American uniforms in the darkness behind, waved them through without detailed inspection. Walsh could scarcely believe their success as they continued toward their objective, his mind racing with the implications of this unexpected development. By 0300 hours, they had reached the outskirts of the small village that intelligence had identified as containing the German headquarters. Walsh had now acquired 4 prisoners and their weapons, but more importantly, he had discovered a method of moving through enemy territory that exploited the hierarchical nature of the German military. German soldiers were conditioned to obey authority and follow procedures without question. In the confusion of darkness and the presumption that anyone moving confidently through German-held territory must be authorized to do so, Walsh had found a vulnerability he could exploit. As they observed the village from a concealed position on a hillside, Walsh began to formulate a plan that went far beyond the original reconnaissance mission. The German headquarters was housed in a stone building that had once been the village's town hall. Guards were posted at the entrance, and military vehicles were parked in the adjacent square. Through binoculars, Walsh could see the glow of lights behind blacked-out windows and regular movement of personnel entering and leaving the building. This was clearly a significant command center, likely coordinating the artillery fire that had been devastating Allied positions. Walsh's original orders had been to observe and report back, but the unexpected success of their journey had planted a seed of audacity in his mind. He turned to Riley and Rossi, outlining a plan so bold that it bordered on madness. "We're going to capture that headquarters," he stated simply. The expressions on his men's faces shifted from disbelief to cautious consideration as he explained his thinking. Walsh's plan relied on the same principles of deception and authority that had already served them well. Using their prisoners as both guides and shields, they would approach the headquarters as if they were a German patrol returning with captured Americans. Once inside, they would use surprise and confusion to secure the facility. The greatest risk was that they would be recognized as imposters before gaining entry, but the late hour and the general fog of war worked in their favor. Walsh instructed Rossi to explain to their most cooperative prisoner that he would be rewarded for his assistance with guarantees of good treatment as a POW. The German, a young private who had expressed no particular loyalty to the Nazi cause, agreed to help navigate the protocols of approaching the headquarters. At 03:30 hours, Walsh and his team, with their 4 prisoners walking ahead as ostensible captors, approached the headquarters building from the main road. Walsh had rearranged their party to create the impression of a German patrol bringing in American prisoners. He and his men had removed their helmets and kept their heads down, shambling forward as if they were exhausted captives. Their German escorts called out to the guards at the entrance, explaining that they had prisoners for interrogation. In the pre-dawn darkness, with only minimal lighting to maintain blackout conditions, the deception worked. The guards waved them toward the entrance, and Walsh felt a surge of both terror and exhilaration as they were admitted into the enemy's command center. Inside the headquarters, the warm air and bright lights after hours in the freezing darkness momentarily disoriented them. The entrance hall led to a main operations room where several German officers were gathered around maps and communication equipment. Walsh knew they had seconds before their deception was discovered. With a subtle signal to Riley and Rossi, he drew his pistol and announced in a clear, commanding voice, "Nobody move. This building is now under American control." The German officers froze in shock, unable to process the sudden reversal. Walsh continued, "My men have this room covered, and American forces have surrounded the building. Surrender immediately, and no one will be harmed." This was, of course, a complete fabrication, but the confidence in Walsh's voice and the absolute unexpectedness of the situation created crucial moments of paralysis among the German command staff. In those vital seconds, Riley and Rossi moved swiftly to secure the doors and disarm the nearest German personnel. Walsh maintained his position, his Colt aimed steadily at the highest-ranking officer he could identify, a colonel who appeared to be the facility commander. "Instruct your men to lay down their weapons," Walsh ordered the colonel. "Do it now, or we will have no choice but to open fire." The colonel, recovering from his initial shock, assessed the situation with the calculation of a veteran officer. He could see only 3 Americans, but the suddenness of their appearance in what should have been a secure headquarters suggested a significant security breach. The possibility that the building was indeed surrounded, as Walsh had claimed, could not be immediately disproven. After a moment of tense silence, the colonel gave a curt nod and issued orders for his staff to comply. What Walsh had not anticipated was the extraordinary chain reaction that his audacious bluff would trigger. As word spread through the building that the headquarters had been captured, German personnel began surrendering in rooms that Walsh and his team had not even entered. The psychological impact of an enemy force appearing suddenly in their command center created a ripple effect of confusion and capitulation. Within 15 minutes, Walsh found himself accepting the surrender of more than 40 German officers and enlisted personnel. all while maintaining the fiction that a substantial American force had somehow infiltrated their position. Rossi moved efficiently through the building, collecting weapons and securing prisoners, while Riley established a defensive position at the main entrance, preventing anyone from leaving to raise an alarm. The situation became even more extraordinary when a German communications officer, believing that the headquarters had been legitimately captured by superior American forces, began instructing outlying units to stand down via radio. Walsh, realizing the potential of this development, had Rossi monitor these communications closely while adding his own instructions. Through the German radio man, they issued orders recalling patrols to the headquarters for new assignments and instructing artillery batteries to cease fire pending recalibration. Each German unit that received these orders had no reason to doubt their authenticity, coming as they did through official channels and using proper codes and protocols. Walsh could scarcely believe the expanding scope of their deception as more German forces began to respond to these recalled orders. By 0500 hours, Walsh faced an almost absurd logistical challenge. He had far more prisoners than his small team could reasonably manage. Over 60 German soldiers were now secured in various rooms of the headquarters, with more arriving regularly in response to the recalled orders. Each new arrival was met by German officers already under Walsh's control, who instructed them to surrender their weapons and join the other prisoners. The deception had become self-perpetuating, with captured Germans unwittingly helping to capture their comrades. Walsh knew this situation could not be sustained indefinitely. Daylight would soon reveal the true nature of the American force that had captured the headquarters, and eventually, some German unit would fail to report or question the unusual orders they had received. Walsh made a critical decision to use the German communication system to contact American lines. Using a frequency he knew was monitored by Allied forces, he transmitted a brief coded message. Shamrock 3 to base. Have secured objective with unexpected developments. Request immediate support at coordinates. Delta 73. Authentication code Whiskey Tango 79er. This carefully worded message conveyed his position without revealing the extraordinary nature of his situation, which might have been dismissed as fantasy by headquarters. To his relief, a response came within minutes, indicating that his message had been received and forces would be dispatched immediately. Now he needed only to maintain control until reinforcements arrived. The first light of dawn revealed the true scope of Walsh's achievement. From the headquarters windows, he could see German soldiers continuing to arrive in the village square, responding to the recall orders. Each group was met by German officers under Walsh's control, who directed them to enter the building and surrender their weapons. By 0630 hours, the count of prisoners had exceeded 100, with Walsh, Riley, and Rossi still the only American forces present. The deception had expanded to include German vehicle drivers and motorcycle messengers who arrived with dispatches, only to find themselves added to the growing number of prisoners. Walsh had established a remarkably efficient system, using cooperative German officers to maintain order among the prisoners, while he and his team controlled key access points within the building. At 0700 hours, Walsh heard the distant sound of American armor approaching, the reinforcements he had requested. He instructed Riley to find a way to signal their position without alerting the prisoners to the fact that the surrounding American forces had been entirely fictional. Riley made his way to the roof of the headquarters building, where he used a captured German signal flare to guide the approaching American tanks and infantry. As the American forces secured the perimeter of the village, Walsh finally allowed himself to acknowledge the magnitude of what they had accomplished. What had begun as a simple reconnaissance mission had resulted in the capture of a key German headquarters, the neutralization of artillery batteries that had been hammering American positions, and the capture of an almost unbelievable number of enemy personnel. Major Harrison arrived with the relief force, his expression shifting from concern to astonishment as Walsh briefed him on the situation. "Let me understand this correctly, Lieutenant," Harrison said slowly. "You and 2 men, armed only with pistols, captured this entire headquarters and all these German troops?" Walsh nodded, feeling slightly embarrassed by the incredulous tone of his commander's question. "It was primarily a matter of confusion in psychology, sir," he explained. "Once we had control of their communications, everything else followed logically." Harrison shook his head in amazement. "Logical is not the word I would use, Lieutenant. "I've never seen anything like this in 20 years of military service." The final count of prisoners taken by Walsh and his two-man team would later be documented as 982 German officers and enlisted personnel, with the addition of several late-arriving messengers and a patrol that returned just as American forces were securing the village. The number exceeded 1,000, all captured by 3 American soldiers armed only with pistols, courage, and an extraordinary understanding of the psychology of warfare. The intelligence value of the captured headquarters proved invaluable, providing detailed information on German defensive positions throughout the sector. The artillery batteries that had been silenced by Walsh's deception never resumed their devastating fire on American positions, having been captured intact by advancing Allied forces who encountered no resistance thanks to the confusion Walsh had created. In the official after-action reports, senior officers struggled to find appropriate language to describe Walsh's achievement. Brigadier General William Carson, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, initially refused to believe the accounts until personally interviewing dozens of captured German officers. Lieutenant Walsh exploited a fundamental vulnerability in enemy command structure, Carson's report finally concluded. Through bold action and psychological warfare, he effectively neutralized enemy forces many hundreds of times larger than his own. His actions represent the highest traditions of American military service and contributed significantly to the success of operations in this sector. Walsh received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, while Riley and Rossi each received the Silver Star. The story of the lieutenant with the magic pistol, as Walsh became known among both American and captured German troops, spread rapidly through Allied forces. War correspondents clamored for interviews, and senior commanders studied the operation as a textbook example of how ingenuity could overcome overwhelming odds. Walsh himself remained modest about his achievement, consistently emphasizing the roles played by Riley and Rossi and the element of luck in their initial capture of the German patrol. "We didn't do anything heroic," he insisted in a rare interview granted months later. "We just found a hole in their thinking and walked right through it. Once we controlled their communications, they basically captured themselves." Military historians would later analyze the psychological factors that made Walsh's deception so effective: the rigid hierarchy of the German military, the tendency of soldiers to obey orders without question, and the confusion inherent in nighttime operations, all contributed to the success of the operation. Walsh had intuitively understood and exploited these vulnerabilities in a way that multiplied the effective force of his small team exponentially. His approach would influence military thinking about special operations and psychological warfare for generations to come, demonstrating that in modern warfare, perception could be as powerful a weapon as any artillery piece or tank battalion. The soldier who captured 1,000 enemies armed with nothing but a pistol had provided a lesson in warfare that went far beyond the tactical situation he faced on that cold Italian night in December 1943. He had shown that courage, intelligence, and psychological insight could sometimes accomplish what overwhelming force could not. The story of Lieutenant Walsh's extraordinary achievement spread rapidly through Allied forces in Italy, though many who heard it initially dismissed it as wartime exaggeration. When Stars and Stripes published an account with photographs of the captured German headquarters and the long lines of prisoners, the legend of the Pistol Lieutenant was cemented. Walsh found himself the reluctant focus of attention from war correspondents, senior officers, and even a Hollywood producer who approached him about film rights to his story. Through it all, he maintained the same modest demeanor that had characterized his service before the incident, often deflecting praise to Riley and Rossi, whom he insisted were equally responsible for their success. In the weeks following the capture of the German headquarters, military intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings with Walsh and his team, seeking to understand the psychological dynamics that had made their deception so effective. Dr. Leonard Carmichael, a psychologist attached to Allied headquarters, developed what he called the Walsh Protocol for special operations, a methodology that emphasized exploiting enemy command structures and communication systems rather than applying direct force. Lieutenant Walsh demonstrated that authority is often assumed rather than verified in military structures, Carmichael wrote in his classified report. By controlling the symbols and channels of authority, uniforms, communications, command locations, A small force can exercise influence far beyond its actual combat power. The impact of Walsh's operation extended beyond psychological theory to practical battlefield applications. By February 1944, specially trained teams were implementing variations of his approach behind German lines, disrupting enemy communications and creating confusion that facilitated the Allied advance. General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, personally acknowledged Walsh's contribution to these new tactics. "Your improvisation has become doctrine," he told Walsh during a brief ceremony at Corps headquarters. "You've taught us that the mind can sometimes be more effective than artillery." For Walsh himself, the aftermath of his famous operation brought both recognition and a certain burden. He was promoted to captain and offered a staff position at division headquarters, which he respectfully declined. "I belong with the men in the field," he explained to Major Harrison. "That's where I'm most useful." His request to return to regular combat duties was granted, though his commanders ensured he was never again sent on solo missions behind enemy lines. "You're too valuable to risk on another suicide mission," Harrison told him bluntly. "Besides, every German in Italy probably has a description of you by now." Walsh continued to serve with distinction through the remainder of the Italian campaign, participating in the breaking of the Gustav Line and the advance toward Rome. His understanding of German military psychology made him particularly effective in planning operations against enemy defensive positions. By the time Rome was liberated in June 1944, Walsh had been wounded twice and received additional decorations for bravery. Yet among his fellow soldiers, he remained known simply as the Pistol Captain, the man who had captured 1,000 Germans with nothing but a sidearm and audacity. After the war, Walsh returned to Pennsylvania, declining offers from military intelligence agencies and special operations commands. He reopened the hardware store where he had worked before the war, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children. For decades, he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, even as books and articles continued to analyze his most famous operation. When a military historian interviewed him for a comprehensive study of special operations in World War II in 1977, Walsh's perspective had been distilled by time and reflection. "What happened that night in Italy wasn't about bravery or even clever tactics," he explained. "It was about understanding human nature. People, whether they're German soldiers or anyone else, tend to see what they expect to see and believe what fits their understanding of how the world works. We succeeded because we presented a scenario that, however unlikely, fit within the framework of what enemy soldiers had been trained to accept." The lesson isn't about military deception specifically, but about how preconceptions shape our reality. Sometimes the greatest obstacle isn't the enemy's strength, but the limitations of our own thinking about what's possible. Lieutenant James Alvin Walsh passed away in 1998 at the age of 81, having lived a quiet life that belied his momentary fame as a wartime legend. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his Distinguished Service Cross and his hardware store's 50 years of service to the community, but devoted only a single sentence to the night when, armed with nothing but a pistol and an understanding of human psychology, he had captured 1,000 enemy soldiers and changed the course of a campaign. Perhaps that modest recognition would have pleased him most, a recognition that extraordinary achievements often come from ordinary people who simply refuse to accept that something is impossible. His legacy lives on in military academies worldwide, where the Walsh operation is still studied as a classic example of how asymmetric advantage can be achieved through psychological insight rather than firepower. The basic principles he improvised on that cold December night, controlling communications, exploiting hierarchical assumptions, and creating self-reinforcing patterns of surrender, have been incorporated into special operations doctrine across NATO forces. Yet perhaps the most enduring lesson of Walsh's achievement is more universal: the power of audacity, improvisation, and the refusal to be limited by conventional thinking. Armed with little more than courage and creativity, a single individual can sometimes accomplish what armies cannot. The legend of the Pistol Lieutenant endures in military circles as a testament to human ingenuity over brute force. Decades after the war, during the dedication of a small exhibit honoring the 36th Infantry Division at the Army War College, a faded black and white photograph showed Walsh standing beside the German headquarters he had captured, his expression neither proud nor boastful, but simply determined. The plaque beneath it carried his own words from that last interview. The most powerful weapon in any war isn't the gun or the tank or the plane. It's the mind that uses them. In military academies today, instructors still tell the story of the soldier who captured 1,000 enemies with nothing but a pistol, reminding new generations of officers that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming force, but from daring to imagine what others believe impossible. The end.